love that. We are launching a brand new series this weekend. If you thought just because we had an announcement you were getting out of a sermon, think again, 10 o'clock. Ushers, lock the doors. And I'm serious. We're beginning a brand new series. This series really began for me, it was like 8 or 9 years ago. Roseanne and I were on vacation in Mexico, and we decided to rent a 2-man kayak. I don't know if any one of you, if anybody's ever done this before, but we decided to rent one of these two-man kayaks and go out into the Gulf of Mexico because we thought that would be romantic. And we get about 5 yards out, we get about 10 yards out, and we quickly realize that we have made some sort of a massive mistake. Apparently there's a reason that God has made one-person kayaks. There's a very good reason. And we start going out in the Gulf of Mexico, and we're trying to coordinate, and someone had told us, you need to call out signs, go left, go right, try to coordinate your paddles. And I think about 10 yards in, her paddle had hit me in the head on accident, I think. And we quickly realized, we're just sort of in the Gulf of Mexico. We're just sort of spinning in circles. I mean, it's just not going very well. And somebody on a single-person kayak pulls up, and they go, "Are you guys doing okay?" And we're thinking, "No, we're not." And the guy goes, "Well, when you rented that thing, did they tell you that it's called the divorce boat?" No, they did not. And so consequently, ever since then, anytime we've gone kayaking, which hasn't been very often, we rent a single-person kayak. That's just a far better experience. And I say that because I don't know if any of you have ever tried the Tandem bicycle. Anybody ever been brave enough to try this? For me, when I see this thing, man, I get anxiety. When I look at that, I sort of get nervous. Harry and I actually rode this to church this morning together to beat this RB Alive traffic. We beat the system, man. We're really doing it, Harry. Anyway. Dumb and Dumber joke. We in our neighborhood, there's a couple that rides around on one of these, and when I see it, I just get anxiety looking at that thing, man. I just want to pull up next to him and hand him my card and go, "We do counseling at the church, because you're gonna need it." And you'll see people on this at the beach. You go to La Jolla Shores, you go to Del Mar, Carlsbad. You see people on this thing, and the concept looks fantastic, doesn't it? But the reality of it, if you've ever tried to do this, trying to coordinate your feet, trying to figure out how to get up a hill and who's pedaling how much, the whole thing is just sort of a chaotic experience. And I say that because this is a pretty good metaphor and a pretty good, sort of description, just looking at it, of what the family system or what the family unit is like. That when it comes to moms and dads, when it comes to sons and daughters, when it comes to in-laws, when it comes to, even as a single adult, when it comes to, your parents, when it comes to brothers, sisters, this is essentially what family is. That family is a very, very closely connected experience of a group of individuals trying to coordinate their lives and trying to coordinate their own desires and directions that they want to go, and everybody trying to figure out how somehow to coordinate and make this thing called the family work. And this, many of you, you can stand up and tell the story. This is often a very difficult thing to do, this thing called the family. When it comes to sons, daughters, when it comes to marriage, husbands, wives, it's often, this can be a very painful, difficult experience. And at moments you can go, why are we even doing this? It would be far easier just to do that. That could take you further, and that could take you a lot faster. But here's the thing, and this is why this series is so important and so critical for us over the next few weeks, is because God has asked all of us, even if you're a single adult, God has asked all of us to participate in a family system. We're all a part of, you were born into this world, you became a part of a family unit. Whether you're a Christian or not, God has asked you with brothers, sisters, in-laws, moms, dad, to participate in a family system. And some of us today, this series in real time really matters because you have a lot of threats to making this work. You're currently trying to climb up a hill together. Or maybe you have a threat of a Mack truck called your in-laws. It's constantly, sort of running into you. And trying to figure this out and coordinate. Oh my goodness, it can be a very difficult experience. And the reason this series matters so much is because love alone is not enough to make this work, is it? In fact, often when people say we can't do this anymore, they say we still love each other, but we just can't do this anymore. Love alone, love by itself, is not enough to make this thing called the family work. And chances are pretty good today when it comes to a family relationship, it might be with an in-law, it might be with one of your kids, it might be with your husband, wife. Chances are pretty good because this happens in our culture all the time. People give up on this and say, it would be far, far easier just to go at life alone and abandon a family relationship. And for all of us over the next few weeks, our hope, our prayer is that God will begin to use these family relationships that often are painful or difficult to do something, and we begin to realize that we can go further, we can go faster, we can begin to experience something that's really life-giving when it comes to family relationships. If you have a Bible, turn with me to Matthew chapter 7 is where we are going to be together today. Matthew chapter 7, starting in verse 3. If you don't have a Bible, you can follow along on the screens. That's a great place to follow along, or you can download the CRB app. That's a great place to follow along as well. How we doing, 10 o'clock? Fantastic. Matthew chapter 7, starting in verse 3. I call this the principle of the plank. If you've been hanging around church for a while, I'll use this as my lectern today. If you've been hanging around church for a while, you've probably heard this verse. Jesus is essentially teaching on relationships. And there's application for any relationship, but specifically for family relationships. This principle, this principle of the plank is especially true when it comes to moms, daughters, son, and the whole tandem family experience. Matthew chapter 7, starting in verse 3, Jesus is speaking to his followers, a group of Pharisees, and here's the principle of the plank. Matthew chapter 7, verse 3. Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye, or sisters or mothers or daughter? Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in their eye and pay no attention to the plank in your very own eye? How can you say to your brother or sister, let me take the speck out of your eye, when all the time there is a plank in your very own eye? You hypocrite, Jesus says, first take the plank out of your eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. The principle of the plank. Now, essentially, what Jesus is doing here is it's sort of a Middle Eastern joke. He's telling a joke, sort of lost in our 21st century context, but it's like carpenter humor. I don't know, but he's telling a joke here. And he's essentially saying we all have this tendency. And Jesus is so far ahead of his time in terms of relationships. No other philosophers are talking about relationships at this level in the world of Jesus. He's essentially saying we all have this tendency when it comes to other people to squint and go, wait a second, I think you're doing something wrong. Wait a second, I think you have some sawdust in your eye. Some of us, that's the whole thing you came for today. You live with somebody and they have 20/20 vision when it comes to all your problems and all your wrongdoing. And Jesus is essentially saying the problem with that is not that somebody else is wrong. The problem with that is that as you're looking and evaluating other people's wrongness, you've got a massive plank in your very own eye. And you're going around going, excuse me, I need to point something out. You probably can't see it. But he's going, what is wrong with you? You've got to deal with the plank in your very own eye. Some of you wives today, you're like, yeah, my husband needs to deal with his plank. And when he gets it out of his eye, I'm going to smack him with it because I'm tired of dealing with that thing, man. And he's essentially saying we all have that tendency. I have that tendency. You have that tendency. To want to evaluate, in biking terms, essentially what Jesus is saying is that we all have a tendency, and this is especially true in family relationships, to be concerned or to worry about what someone else's feet are doing and pay no attention to what our feet are doing. We all have a tendency to evaluate what someone else's feet are doing on the bike and pay no attention to what our feet are doing. And Jesus is essentially going, whoa, 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 whoa. There needs to be some boundaries here. You need to stop trying to take responsibility for all their wrongdoing. He's not saying that you can't evaluate someone else's sin as a mom, dad. He's not saying you can never speak into the life of somebody else. He's just saying that before you evaluate someone else's wrongness or someone else's sin, you have to constantly be evaluating your own. And once you've taken this out and you've dealt with this, then you're actually free to help somebody else in this experience. He's essentially talking about boundaries. All relationships, whether you're a Christian or not, all relationships need boundaries. If you don't have boundaries in relationships, then people get hurt and relationships fall apart. Some of us, you could stand up and tell that story. If you don't have boundaries, people get hurt and relationships fall apart. At a practical level, have you ever wondered why it's often easier to get along with people who live outside of your house than it is to get along with people who live inside of your house? If you can't say amen, say ouch. Have you ever wondered, like, why is it I can get along with my neighbor who I see twice a week and he's quirky, but I can't get along with my kids. I can't seem to get it. And for some of us, this is really painful because the people that you love the most have caused you the most pain and the most hurt. And oftentimes the opposite is true. The people who love you the most, you have inflicted the most pain. And why is it with people outside of our house, often that's easy, but when it comes to people inside of our house that we're supposed to be in this experience with, it's just very difficult. And I would say one of the reasons, or the reason, is because in all other relationships, except family relationships, there are clearly defined boundaries that are in place. When it comes to your neighbor, you have a clearly defined boundary, whether you live in a condo, apartment complex, townhouse, house, there is a clearly defined boundary, isn't there? There is a property line that exists. But when it comes to family relationships, trying to distinguish what's mine, what's yours, what are you responsible for, what am I responsible for, when does your mess become my mess, that's difficult. It's easy with neighbors. Your neighbor is not allowed to start parking in your driveway and go, I am so sorry, but we're pack rats over here, and you're just gonna have to deal with it. Your neighbor is not allowed to do that. You have a very clear line of responsibility. You have a very clear line of who has responsibility for what. But with family, that's difficult, isn't it? With your neighbor, it's easy. His weed problem, you can't allow that to become your weed problem. I mean that in an agricultural sense, by the way. That joke's a slow burn, but man, no pun intended. You have a clear property line. But with family, all of a sudden, their problem becomes your problem, and you're trying to figure out, wait a second, what's going on here? All other relationships, there's boundaries. But with family, that's difficult. What essentially, at a granular level, what a boundary is all about is about responsibility. It's what belongs to who? What's your role? What's my role? You have this at work. People have job descriptions. There's boundaries that are in place. But with family, that's really difficult to do. And all families are essentially trying to coordinate whose responsibility is what. You understand this. When you brought your son or daughter home from the hospital, you were responsible. When they were born, you were responsible for everything, weren't you? You were responsible for feeding them. You were responsible for holding their head up so that they could eat. You were responsible for everything. But over time, isn't it true? Their responsibility had to increase and your responsibility had to decrease. Over time, they had to take responsibility for things that used to be your responsibility. The property line of responsibility, the boundary had to change over time. What used to be your burden over time, it had to become their burden. And when it comes to neighbors, that's easy. But when it comes to family, it's very difficult to decide and determine where that property line of responsibility exists. You see this a lot, and where this gets really practical. How many of us, you've ever met somebody in their 20s or 30s who blames all of their problems on their parents? Use your imagination. I'm sure it will be difficult to think of an example. Yeah, this happens all the time. Some of us, you have this challenge with your son or daughter who's in their 20s or 30s. They are experts at noticing all of your sawdust, aren't they? They see it all. I mean, they can sort of determine all the things that you did wrong when they were 12, or when they're great at seeing their sawdust. And when someone in their 20s or 30s, when they start blaming their parents for all of their problems, if it was a neighbor, this would be easy. You would realize that your messy garage is your issue. But when it comes to parents, and you start blaming your parents for your bad behavior, essentially what you're doing is you're saying, my bad behavior is still your responsibility. I don't understand where the property line begins and ends. On the other side of the coin, how many of us, you've ever met someone whose son or daughter's in their 30s or 40s? And as a mom, as a dad, they still feel responsible for their adult son or daughter. And I don't mean that in sort of a love sense and, you're still connected, of course, but they still feel responsible. And when you ask her, how are the kids? They would say, oh man, Justin, he can't hold down a job. He can't hold down a relationship. And you're going, isn't he like 42? And there's something when they say it, they're still taking ownership of it. And if it was a neighbor, it would be easy. It's his issue. I can't let the tree limbs of his addiction or whatever keep falling in my driveway. But when it's a son, when it's a daughter, this is difficult. And what begins to happen over time is that as a mom, your son or daughter, that you still feel responsible, and you feel responsible for their life. And the problem is they don't feel any responsibility. They don't feel any responsibility for their life. And so what happens is over 40 years, mom, dad, you've been peddling for two people for 40 years, and you're tired and you're getting cynical, and he's been sitting on the back going, wee, for a long time. And it just starts to break down. There has to be rules of responsibility. When is the plank in my eye your issue? And when is it just my issue? This happens in marriage all the time. Some of us, you've experienced this. When people come to the church for marriage counseling, one of the things that you begin to realize very early on, and this has been true for Rosanna and I as well, I'll talk about that in a few moments, but often what begins to happen is that one person feels all the responsibility to make the marriage work, and one person doesn't feel any responsibility, and he or she's just sitting on the back going, wee! And cynicism and anger and hostility starts to creep in. I'll give you a few examples. And I'll kind of pick on the men, the husbands for a second, because I don't really know much about being a good woman, but I'll just just from a man's standpoint, often how this sort of plays itself out is that dad has an anger problem. Some of us, you grew up in a house like this. Dad's got an anger issue. He has a temper, and when he walks in the door, the whole house can shake. And mom doesn't know what to do about it. And over time, some of us, you grew up in a house like this. Over time, mom conditions herself, and she conditions the kids with rules around how to not make dad angry. Well, don't talk to him before 6 o'clock. Just let him watch TV. Just let him go. Just don't even, no, he's in the garage. Don't go in the garage when he's in the garage. He needs to stop by the bar on the way home. He needs to take the edge off. Trust me, it'll be better for all of it. There begins to be, and the whole house starts to tilt away. And what happens over time is that mom has taken responsibility for his inability to deal with the plank that's in his eye. And the whole house is now pedaling a lot faster, and dad's just sitting on the back with a plank in his eye going, wee. And it starts to break down the family system, and this becomes a miserable experience for everyone but one person. The way this starts to flesh itself out, the way this starts to become really real in households is that one of the things you'll notice is that when dad's anger, or whatever the issue is, blows up, when it all of a sudden it starts to affect a lot of people, he doesn't feel guilty for this at all. He doesn't feel responsible for it. So he doesn't feel guilty. He doesn't apologize for it. In fact, what often happens in those situations, and some of us, you've experienced this, everybody else, mom, the kids apologize, and they feel guilty for setting dad off because they've taken responsibility for the plank in his eye. And Jesus is just going, wait a second. That's his issue that he needs to deal with. And now everybody in the family begins to participate in a system that's actually just keeping him dysfunctional. When at the end of the day, he's trying to make it all about someone else's sawdust when it's actually just about the plank that's in his eye. And he needs to deal with this. The family system only works when everyone begins to live with this sense that I'm not responsible for everyone, but I am responsible to everyone. Every family needs this rule. Unless your kids are 5, you need to have this. We're not responsible for each other. There is going to be something in you and there's going to be something in me that because you love somebody from a good place, you're going to want to take responsibility for someone's plank. and you're going to try to fix it. You want to do something about their sawdust, but we're not responsible for each other. We are responsible to each other, which means I have a role to play in making this whole family thing work. And I constantly have to be looking in the mirror and doing something about the planks in my eye, because if I don't, it's going to affect all these people that I love very much. I need to do something about them. I'm responsible to you. I've got a role to play in making this thing work and making sure that it doesn't crash and making sure that you're not just pedaling to pick up for my slack. There is something in all of us, because you love your family, that will want to take responsibility for the planks in their eye and for the sawdust in their eye. We all want to do that. And it doesn't mean that you're cold and you disengage, but they have to begin to take responsibility for the plank in their very own eye. This happens as husbands as well. We want to take responsibility. We want to fix it. We want to try to get the plank out for them. And until they come to the moment and go, wait a second, it never comes out of their eye, doesn't it? Does it? And it doesn't matter how much you want to get the thing out. They have to take responsibility for it. My kids do this. They want to take responsibility for the planks in each other's eye, at least on, once a day, probably more like 750 times a day. Our 4-year-old, Hayden, will run into the house and he will be saying, Dane hit me, Dane hit me, Dane hit me, Dane hit me. And essentially what he's doing in that moment is he's going, sawdust, 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 sawdust. And inevitably, when you sit him down and you say, Hayden, did you do anything to provoke your brother? Every single time he will say something to the effect of, yes, I punched him and he's currently bleeding in the driveway. Buddy, this isn't about his sawdust. This is actually about your plank, and you need to take responsibility for your part in this thing. All levels of the family, we've all got plank issues. And our tendency when we have the plank is we want to turn it into sawdust conversations. We want to make it about someone else's sawdust when it actually has something to do with our plank. It was several years ago, and when Rosanna and I got married, the way this has sort of fleshed itself out in our marriage is the first couple of years of marriage for us were very difficult. And I meet people all the time that say, hey, the first couple of years of marriage, those are the fun years, those are the great years. And then we had kids, and it all of a sudden became like a razor blade slide. It was just like all of a sudden going down. But when we were newlyweds, man, that was the fun part. That was the easy part. That was not, if that's your story, good for you. That was not the story for Rosanna and I. The first couple of years of marriage were very painful and very difficult for us. And if I'm honest with you, a lot of the issue had to do with me, believe it or not. I know it's hard to believe. But it had to do with the fact that when we got married for 28 years, this is what life would look like. For 28 years, I was by myself, or I had parents, but I wasn't raised by a pack of wolves. But I had been single, and you start developing your own systems. And when you're single, and all of a sudden you start trying to do this becomes a very herky-jerky experience, and you're trying to figure out how are we going to make this whole thing work. And one of the challenges for us is that when you're by yourself and you're angry, nobody knows you're angry, do they? When you're by yourself and you're anxious, nobody knows that you're anxious. But when you get married, it's essentially like having a massive mirror where you're constantly having to look at yourself. And now you've got somebody going, why are you so angry? And you're going, I'm not angry. What are you talking about? Why are you so sensitive? I'm not sensitive. What are you talking about? Now you've got someone there who sees it all. Now, and oftentimes, and I don't have time to get into it, but I'll drive by it for a second. When people abandon this and they just want to go back to this, it usually, very seldom does it have something to do with the other person. It has to do with the fact that they've been looking at a mirror of themselves for a long time and they don't like what they see and they just don't want to deal with it. Because this is a lot easier to do. And so for Rosanna and I, I began to realize, man, this is a herky-jerky experience. And I went to lunch with a friend one day, and he's a single guy, and he was asking me about marriage and how it was going, and I was not doing a good job of promoting marriage. And I was sitting down with him, and I was essentially trying to have a sawdust conversation. Let me tell you about all of Rosanna's sawdust. And as he's listening to me talk, and he's known me for a long time, he says, I actually, as I hear you talk, I don't know if this has anything to do with her. I think it has to do with you. And I was like, shut up. You don't know what you're talking about. And he was right. And he said, I think you need to see a counselor because there's some stuff from your childhood. He known me for a long time that's being kicked up. It is actually really affecting her. And he was essentially saying, I think you got a plank. I think you need to deal with it. And so went to counseling and started, this is a couple years into marriage, started to realize that I had this cycle. The way I was trying to pedal on the bike was I was trying to control and control and control. And when I couldn't control, I would withdraw and withdraw and withdraw. I was a lot of fun to deal with. Control, 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 withdraw, withdraw, withdraw. And so as we started to identify that, and now we've been married 44 years, we began to realize there has to be a shift in how we talk about issues. There has to be a shift, and it started to level the playing field. It started to make this experience of the tandem ride, it started to sort of level it out, because all of a sudden what I began to realize was that when I was trying to talk about someone's sawdust, it actually had a lot to do with my plank. And 7, 8 years later, when I get home from work or whatever it is, and I want to walk in the door and I start powering up and I want to start controlling, because whatever the issue is, something's a wreck or the kids are screaming or there's mess everywhere, and I want to power up and I want to start to control, control, control. In those moments, it's instead of making it about someone's sawdust, there's now common language for everyone on the bike to go, wait a second, this has to do with your plank. This is about the plank in my eye. This isn't about your sawdust. This is about me. This is about me. And what I've realized is that when you sit down with your loved ones and you say, wait a second, I think I've got a plank in my eye. When you sit down with people, you say, you know what? I think I have a control issue. In my experience, no one that I love has ever looked back at me and gone, really? You don't say? No, they know long before you know that this is in your eye. And all of a sudden, when you begin to approach the tandem family experience from this vantage point, it begins to change the experience of the ride. I'm gonna give you just a few questions as we close, as you think through your family relationships. We're gonna be talking about this for the next 3 weeks, but I just wanna give you a few questions that might help you understand and help all of us understand whether or not you're a candidate to get a plank out of your eye. Let me ask you a question. Are you currently trying to control everybody else and losing control over yourself? Are you losing control of yourself, but you're trying to gain and exert control over everyone else? Your temper, your addictions, your behaviors, you've lost control of yourself, but currently you're trying to gain control. Your self-control knob has turned way down, but your others' control knob is cranked way up. You might be a candidate to get a plank out of your eye. You might be a candidate to get rid of a plank. Let me ask you another question. When you talk about your family, is everybody else the villain and you're always the victim? Is everyone else, and when you talk about your family, is it always, she always and he never, and if he would only, and they only show up at this Christmas, and I don't like my uncle, and I don't even know if he's my uncle anyway, and all these sort of, you want to start talking about people, and you start, they're just the villain, and you always talk in such a way that you're always the victim. You might be a candidate to get a plank out of your eye. And there might be some issues with some other family members, and some boundaries need to be drawn because you're tired of the limbs of their issues falling into your driveway. But you are responsible for the plank that's in your eye and how it affects everyone else. Let me ask you another question. Are you currently playing while someone else is paying? You're just kind of doing your own thing. You just kind of think about you. And you got kind of this married people facade, this family facade that's going on. But essentially, you live as a single person and you don't pay a lot of attention. You're just playing. You're just doing what you want. And someone else is paying the emotional toll for that decision. Someone else is pedaling twice as fast and twice as hard. And they're out of breath and they don't know how to talk to you about it. You might be a candidate to get a plank out of your eye. And when you have those conversations and you sit down with someone, you go, you know what? I've been trying to gain control, but I've been losing control of myself. When you sit down and you go, you know what? I'm sorry. I've tried to make all of you the villains and I've just been the victim. What you realize is you have become not just a candidate to get a plank out of your eye, you have become a candidate to experience grace. Grace is the foundation of this whole God thing. And in that moment, what you'll experience is grace from a physical person, and you will also experience grace from an invisible God. And that's the foundation of what makes this family thing work. Let's pray together. God, we need you. God, your presence, your activity in our family. God, you're a God of oneness. You're a God that brings us together. It doesn't rip us apart. And something about the family, it's really hard to do this. And there's someone within the sound of my voice, even as I'm talking about this, they're already thinking through what family member they're gonna send this talk to because they got somebody in mind that really needs to hear it. But God, I just pray, would you raise the mirror? Would you allow us to deal with the plank? Would you allow us to all of a sudden approach people, talk to people in different ways? Would we have plank conversations instead of sawdust conversations? God, we're all people that need grace. Would we extend it towards ourselves? Would we extend it to somebody today? God, we need you. Our families need you. It's in Jesus' name we pray. And all of God's children said,